In this video, I'm going to be painting from my photo reference of this goldfinch sitting on one of my sunflowers. My photo isn't real high quality, so there's some things that I'll just have to improvise. But first, let's go over the colors. First, I have a nice warm yellow, kind of an orangish yellow, then a cool yellow or lemon yellow, a warm red or kind of an orangish red, a cool red, leaning a little toward magenta, a warm blue, this is phthalo blue, so it's kind of a greenish blue, and then my cool blue is going to be ultramarine blue. I will also be using a little bit of this gray color, it's just kind of a neutral pigment, and also a little bit of white gouache. You'll need just an assortment of brush sizes, so I have my largest brush here, a medium round brush, and then a small round brush to do some of the detail work. And then I will also be using a white gel pen and then a black micron pen. The micron pen is waterproof, but I'll be adding those strokes last, so you don't really need to worry about having waterproof ink for this project. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of just use some clear water to get my paper wet so that I can apply a really nice soft light wash. And I'm not being careful to stay in the lines at all. For this first wash, it's really okay for it to be very soft and to even bleed outside the edges. In fact, for the first portion of this painting, we really don't need to be overly careful with anything or make sure to stay within the lines. So I'm just applying a light yellow wash over pretty much everything, so the bird and the entire flower. And this being a goldfinch, obviously the bird is going to be primarily yellow in color. My sunflower actually doesn't have any petals on it, and so the center of the sunflower will be yellow, and then the rest will be green. But I'm going to start out with yellow because I think that's going to be a nice base wash for this project. And for the background, I'm going to keep it very simple, and since a lot of my subject is going to be yellow, I decided to just go with kind of a neutral violet color for the background because violet is a complement for yellow. So I'm hoping that by using a complementary color for the background, I'm going to help some of the yellows in my subject really pop. And I'm not going to be overly careful with the background. I don't need it to be like a really nice smooth wash or anything like that. The only thing I'm trying to be careful of is not to spill too much of that violet onto the parts of the flower and the bird that I want to stay really yellow. Of course, if some bleeding occurs, that's totally fine, and it's bound to happen, and especially on these leaves it's really a lot less important, but I'm going to be really careful around my bird to make sure that those colors don't bleed onto my bird. And this is just kind of a situation where I'm actually using my largest brush. I'm just having to manipulate and maneuver my brush around those really small detailed areas. but I don't really want to use a small brush to do this wash because it would be very tedious and take a really long time, and you definitely would not get a wash. It would kind of be a little bit disjointed if you used a really small brush. So just be as careful around those areas as you can, but as I said, if there's a little bit of color bleed, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal, especially on the plant, because we'll be going over a lot of that with greens. And now I've mixed up a little bit more purple, and I am using a smaller brush just to get into those really narrow crevices. But for the most part, it's going to be better to just use your larger brush and just try to keep everything nice and soft, but don't worry about getting some, funky marks on the background, because we do just want to kind of keep that soft and abstract. And now I'm actually using a little bit more of this violet mixture to begin to go onto the bird and mark some of the darker markings. And I ended up just Googling a photograph of a goldfinch so that I could see some of the details a little bit better in what goldfinches are supposed to look like, because the photo I took, I actually took it with just my camera phone, and I took it pretty far away from the bird and also through a window, so my photo reference is just pretty low quality. And now I'm just going around on the flower with that violet mixture. I'm keeping it very light and watery, but I'm kind of marking where all the shadow areas are going to be. When I add shadows, I do like to use the complement, so it just so happened to be the same color as my background. So if I have a yellow subject, then if I want to add a shadow, I would lightly add purple. If I had a subject that was blue, then I would actually use orange to kind of bring out some shadows. And now I'm going back in with some more yellow. This time it's just a little bit more concentrated and bold. And I'm really looking at my photo reference to see areas where sunlight is really hitting, or where the yellows are brightest and boldest. But I don't necessarily want to go in and just completely cover up that first wash that I applied, because when you're doing watercolor painting, it's really important to maintain some of those really light values. Since watercolors are transparent, we can't very easily go back in later and add those light values. So it's really important just to be careful and not completely cover up all of those light values. And so far I've just been going back and forth between yellow and purple, and this is just how I sometimes will begin a painting, just to map out the areas that are, receiving the most light and have the most pure color, and then using the complement to mark darker areas. But I definitely will be using the full spectrum of color in this painting. It just so happens that the color scheme is pretty simple. And now I'm using my lemon yellow, whereas before I had mostly just used my warm yellow. And I'm using this really bright lemon yellow to really mark out areas that are getting a lot of sunlight. And so these are the areas that I want to really be the brightest. And this is almost a dull green. I know it's really hard to tell and it looks kind of gray or brown, but I used my ultramarine blue with a little bit more of my yellows. And I'm just adding this to the sunflower, again, just the areas that are kind of in shadow. In areas that you want to remain really light and bold, you won't have to build up those areas quite as much as you will the shadows. Since watercolor is transparent, then you actually have to work pretty hard to get darker values and shadows. And so that's going to just require lots of layering. And now I'm going into my phthalo blue. So this is kind of a nice, bright, pretty greenish blue. And I'm using this to start marking areas that I want to be very, very cool in temperature. So there's going to be some shadowed areas that are receiving a little bit more sunlight, and the areas in shadow that are receiving the least sunlight and that I want to be the darkest, I also want those to be a lot cooler in value. So if you think about light as being warm, then, you know, obviously your highlights in your brightest areas are going to tend to be warmer colors, and then as you move more into the shadows, you're going to have a lot more cool colors because that's a little bit of contrast to the sunlight. And now I'm using that phthalo blue to mix into some of the yellow I already had on my palette. And I usually find that phthalo blue makes a much brighter green than any green that I usually get from using the ultramarine blue. And ultramarine blue, if you compare it to the phthalo blue, it's a little bit closer to violet, so it kind of makes sense that the greenish blue is going to make your brightest greens. Now I'm going to actually start mixing up some orange, and I will be using that just to add a little bit of definition into the center of the sunflower. And at this point in the painting, I'm still able to work very loose. You can see that I'm using my larger round brush. I'm not using my largest brush, that flat brush, but I am using this just to add more glazes into this painting. And when you're glazing watercolor, basically what you're doing is you're applying a very thin wash on top of color that has already had time to dry. And so those colors will mix optically rather than literally mixing together. I'm also applying a little bit of this warm orange tone to some parts of the leaves. Usually when you look at leaves, and it may not always be completely obvious from photo references, but leaves tend to get a little bit dry at the end, which usually results in them kind of turning a little bit brown or orange. So that's just something I'm adding in just to make my sunflower look a little bit more alive and more realistic. And now I'm using my smallest brush, and I'm starting to go into the dark markings on the bird. And I'm trying to be careful so that you can actually see what I'm doing here, but I don't want to cover up all of that area, because a lot of times there's just little bits of lighter areas within the feathers, even within the dark areas. And in the end, I'll end up kind of accentuating those even more with white gouache and also my white gel pen. But I don't want to go in and just make that a big dark spot. I want to leave a little bit of those lighter areas in there. And now I'm using that same dark mix with just more water in it to start glazing some texture into the flowers and some shadow. The bird that was actually sitting on my sunflower didn't have this dark crest, but the photo reference that I looked up had that, so I decided to add that in because I kind of like that. And now I'm using more yellow to actually add some texture to the areas that are getting more light. So I don't want to use that purple to go into the areas of the bird that are actually getting a lot of light. I'm just using more concentrated yellow to create some really subtle texture. And I'm also going to use that yellow on some of the sunflower leaves that are getting a lot of sunlight, and so they're almost like a lime green. And I'm not going to be doing anything else to the background of this painting, and so I want to build up the sunflower and the leaves enough that there's contrast. Right now I don't think that there's a lot of contrast between the leaves of the sunflower and that background, so I'll just continuously work on building that up. And now I've just added a little bit more red to that mixture. Might be a little bit strong, so I'm trying to balance it out with a little bit of yellow as well. And if you mix something and you take it too far to one side or the other, you might just want to dilute it a little bit or add more of the other color to kind of take it back into that other direction. So that's why I added a little bit more yellow, and I also added a little bit more water to that mix. And I'm just using this to continue defining that center of the sunflower. And now I'm mixing that orange with the violet mixture that I already had, so that I can add a little bit more shadow and definition to the center of the sunflower. But since that sunflower is actually getting a lot of light, I won't need to use very much of this mixture, and I don't want to overdo it. But you can see that if you apply it lightly enough, with enough water mixed into the pigments, that it will be a very subtle effect. And it really doesn't even look like it's purple, it just looks like it's a very dark orange. And now I'm mixing up a really dark but bright green, if that makes sense. So I'm using my phthalo blue mostly, and then I added in some of my lemon yellow, but I used a lot of blue, and so it's really leaning more toward that cool temperature. And I even borrowed a little bit of the orange mixture just to tone it down, because orange and something that's a little bit more blue is going to create a more neutral color, although it's still very cool in temperature. And I'm just using this to further define my shadowed areas in these leaves. And again, I just don't want to overdo this part. I don't want to obliterate the parts of the leaves that are actually getting a lot of light, and so I'm referring back to my photo reference pretty frequently just to make sure that I'm only applying this dark kind of toned down blue to the areas that are most in shadow. Now I'm just mixing up a little bit more green, but this time it has a lot more yellow in it than blue. And I'm just slowly adding that phthalo blue because phthalo blue is such a strong pigment that what looks like a little bit of that phthalo blue mixed in with yellow can very quickly overpower it and turn it into a bluish green. And I really want to keep this green on the yellow side, so that I can just add a little bit more definition into the leaves that are getting a lot of light. And there's some leaves that they're not really getting the most light, but they're also not in shadow, and so I just want to use a little bit more green glaze just to take those down in value a little bit. And now I'm mixing up a little bit of a darker green. I'd say this is almost like a true green. It's sort of right in between the blue and the yellow side. And I'm using that to add a little bit of definition, especially at the base of those flowers that are attached to this, or the base of those leaves, I'm sorry, that are attached to the center of the flower. And some of those areas that are just kind of in the middle between light and dark. And now I'm going back into that really dark kind of purplish gray mixture, and I'll be adding more texture now, and so I'm kind of going back and forth between that really dark purplish gray and then the other mixture right next to it, which is basically just yellow and violet mixed together, so that I can continue to add just a little bit of feathery texture. And with feathers, we all know that feathers tend to be very soft and delicate, so it's better just to not go overboard. You don't need to paint every little thing that you see in your photo reference. Of course, with my photo reference, I basically can't see any detail, but I am going off of this other reference that I just found on the internet just to get a better sense of some of the details. But it's better with really soft textures to underdo it rather than to overdo it. And just keep that mix with a lot of water in it so it doesn't go too dark. And I'm mostly focusing on the edges right now because I don't want the bird to just seem like really smooth and solid, because those feathers kind of create a soft edge around the bird. And so I'm just using this to very delicately add a little bit of softness outside the boundaries of the bird. And now I need to just add a little bit of orange to the beak. I don't want it to be too bright though, so I added just a little bit of blue to it, and maybe I took it a little bit too close to brown, so I added more red back into it. And that's the thing about mixing colors, is sometimes you just have to go back and forth before you get the right balance that you're looking for. But I didn't want that beak to be too bright and orange, so that's why I added just a little bit of blue. And I'm applying that, and it seems like maybe it's just a little bit too brown. So I went back into just that little bit of red. And applying just a little bit of light red on top of the yellow that I already have there will create an orange. We're getting really close to being done. I'm just going back in with some nice bright lemon yellow just to re-accentuate some of those highlights. And now I'm using just a little bit of white gouache to add some of those lighter feathers onto the dark areas, and also to help define the eye a little bit more, because the eye has kind of blended in with the dark crest on the bird. And you have to be a little bit careful when you're using white gouache. A lot of people who watercolor don't like to use it at all. I think it's okay as long as you just use it very, very sparingly, because it is opaque. It's not transparent like watercolor. Gouache is very similar to watercolor, except that the pigment is more concentrated, and so it kind of has, compared to watercolor, a more milky consistency. So if you overuse it, it just kind of makes everything look washed out. But if you use it very, very sparingly, just to add subtle details, it usually can be pretty effective. And you can even mix it with your watercolor to create an opaque color that has a little bit of color in it. So I mixed a little bit of yellow in with my white gouache, just so I could add some yellow highlights to the bird. And one area that I'm seeing needs some improvement is that big leaf off to the left. It just needs a little bit more definition. So I'm mixing up a really nice dark green that has a little bit of red in it, so it's not super bright, it's a little bit toned down. And I'm going to use that just to define that leaf a little bit better. And to define some of these other areas that are in shadow. And again, just going back in with some of that really dark grayish violet into the bird, just to add a little bit more texture, especially around the edges where the dark markings are meeting the light yellow markings. I'm just using some very short strokes to kind of feather out those areas and make them blend together a little bit more naturally. And I'm also adding a little bit of definition into the beak. Now I'm just cleaning off my palette, and I decided I would see if I could brighten up some of these yellow areas, but because that color is so transparent, it's not going to make a real big difference at this point. So I'm just kind of using it on the very ends of the leaves and in the center of the flower, where it at least has a chance to brighten things up a bit. And now I'm using my black micron pen just to add a little bit more texture actually into these dark feathers on the bird. And they're not going to be super obvious. They'll be most effective toward that edge of the bird where I'm just softening up the edges a little bit by adding very short hatch marks. But I'm not going to use my pen at all to do outlining or anything like that, because I don't want this to look like a coloring book or something like that. So I'm just using it to further define some of the darkest areas. And I'm using very thin broken lines around some of the leaves just to further define them. But again, I do not want to do any kind of outlining at all, so I'm using my pen very, very sparingly. And just adding a little bit of texture into that stem as well. And now I'm going in with my white gel pen, and I will use this even less than I used my black Micron pen. So I added a tiny little highlight to the bird's eye, and then kind of not even a half circle, maybe 1/3 circle around the eye. I didn't want to completely circle around the eye and make it look cartoonish, but just wanted to add a little bit of light definition to separate the eye from the dark feathers. And then I'm also going to use short hatch marks to further define some of those light feathers. And that's it. So I'm just slowly taking the tape off, and then I will show you kind of up close what this ended up looking like. So we kept that background nice and simple and abstract, and I think that really helps the bird and also the sunflower to pop.